I can hardly believe we've finally arrived. Sally hoisted another box onto the kitchen table and started unpacking more dishes. With how slowly the solicitors were moving, I never thought we'd actually get to move in on schedule. "Well, we're here now," Pete replied, setting down his drill and wrapping his arms around his wife, burying his face in her neck beneath her dark locks. "Hey, no time for that. Get back to putting up those shelves," Sally teased, playfully nudging Pete away. "It would be great to have everything organized and unpacked. I was thinking we could head to the village pub later to introduce ourselves and meet some locals." "Nay, beer sounds nice," Pete grunted as he hoisted the heavy shelf onto its brackets. "I'm sure people are curious about who's moved in here if they haven't already heard. You know how these small towns are." The quaint village of Rudtrow Clough was tucked away in the northern hills, surrounded by fields, rugged terrain, and deep valleys filled with streams and rocks, ancient pathways and shadowy forests. Now it was home to Pete and Sally Western, a place that felt just right, especially since Sally had landed a teaching job at the local school, while Pete, a landscape painter, was thrilled that the stunning scenery would inspire his art. As Pete and Sally stepped into the cool darkness of the late February evening, they walked along the narrow main street toward the White Lamb pub, where a warm amber light spilled from the windows onto the stone pavement outside. Just as Sally was about to push the door open, she had to step back as a burly man in overalls and a wool hat exited the pub in a huff, muttering to himself. If he noticed Pete and Sally, he didn't acknowledge them, and the door slammed shut behind him. "That doesn't sound promising," Pete remarked, glancing down the street as the man stomped away, still mumbling to himself. "Maybe he was just in a hurry," Sally suggested, trying to keep things upbeat. She was determined that their new life in Rudtrow Clough would begin on a positive note. "Come on, let's grab a drink." The White Lamb had a traditional and dimly lit atmosphere, exuding warmth and coziness thanks to a crackling fire around, which a small group gathered. At another table, a couple engaged in a peculiar board game featuring egg-shaped pieces. As Pete and Sally made their way to the bar, a middle-aged man with a noticeable belly emerged from a side room, drying his hands with a towel. "Hello," he greeted in a calm tone. "Can I assist you with something?" Pete was slightly taken aback by the man's composed demeanor. "Yes, we were hoping to grab a drink. We just moved into the village." "Oh, so you're the new teacher at the school," the man remarked, glancing at Sally as he folded the towel with his large red hands. His expression remained neutral, but his gaze lingered a moment too long. "That's correct." "I start on Monday," Sally replied, meeting the man's eyes, fully aware of the mixed feelings that might arise about an outsider teaching in their community. "That caused quite a stir, didn't it?" the man said. "It's not common for someone unfamiliar to take such an important role in our little town. But for some reason the governors approved it. That guy who just left didn't seem too pleased." Pete chimed in, trying to shift the topic. "Taylor? Don't worry about him," the man shrugged. "Taylor Ackroyd is all right. He's just struggling after losing his son last year. He'll be fine. Eventually." Pete and Sally exchanged cautious looks, and a heavy silence enveloped them. Finally, Sally broke the tension. "2 pints of your finest bitter, please, if that's all right." The man scratched his cheek, pondering her request. "That'll be our local brew," he said before pouring 2 pints of the frothy ale. "I'm Dan Oaklands, by the way. We're not really accustomed to strangers in Rudtrow Clough," he paused, "but I'm sure you'll manage," and flashed a crooked grin. The next morning, feeling restless from a troubled night's sleep and exhausted from moving, an apprehensive Sally walked through the gates of Rudtrow Clough Primary School, where she was welcomed by the head teacher, Hazel Hartshorn. "You made it," Hazel smiled warmly. "So, you haven't changed your mind?" "No, not yet anyway," Sally responded, relieved by the friendlier reception compared to her experience at the White Lamb. However, she thought to herself that if yesterday was any indication, fitting in here would be quite the challenge. "Oh." Hazel paused, raising her eyebrows as she glanced at Sally while opening the main door of the school. "Just the guy from the pub. Not exactly friendly, but I'm sure it will be." "All right," Sally dismissed her remark, realizing she might have overstepped. In the staff room, while enjoying a cup of coffee, Hazel explained the upcoming curriculum to Sally. Naturally, during this season, our primary focus for the children is getting ready for the spring festival. Easter? Something along those lines? Not quite Easter. We honor the more ancient customs of springtime, Hazel said as she rummaged through her bag. I thought you might need some details, so I brought this for you to check out. And she handed Sally a small photo album with the river and the red tree, neatly printed on the cover. This seems old, Sally remarked, examining the album. Its cover, smoothed by time. The red tree. Does that relate to the village's name? Exactly. The red tree by the river is the centerpiece of our spring festival. The photos will be helpful. My father took them back in the 60s. Have a look, Hazel said, a shadow crossing her face. It's crucial that you do. Later that evening, cozy on the sofa with a glass of wine, Sally began flipping through the yellowed pages of Hazel's album. It was filled with black and white images, starting with a group of small children in a classroom, each proudly displaying a painted egg. Some were simply decorated, while others featured flowers, trees, animals, moons, and stars. The caption, Byrd preparing the eggs. The next page showcased a basket brimming with eggs, titled Offerings for Spring, followed by more pictures of children painting eggs or posing with them for the camera. There were also photos of adults dressed smartly, some holding children's hands, and one of a man in a long cape, all eyes directed towards him. Hey Pete, check this out, Sally called to her husband, who was seated at the kitchen table sketching. Look at these vintage photos of the village in spring. It looks like they have some kind of festival. Pete lifted his gaze from his sketchbook. The album caught his interest, and he began flipping through its pages, grinning at some images while appreciating the artistry with a discerning eye. However, his smile quickly faded. Wait a second, have you seen all of these? No. Why? Sally pulled up a chair and peered at the page that was open. It depicted a group of children standing by the riverbank, beneath a tall, twisted tree, whose lower branches were adorned with decorated eggs. The children were frozen in place around a cloaked figure, who held a small boy aloft, his head drooping, and eyes shut tight against the sky. The caption below read Light and Dark, the Cycle of Life. It seems like it might be part of a play they performed during the festival, Sally suggested, turning to the next page, which featured a close-up of eggs, hanging from the tree's branches. I can ask Hazel about it tomorrow. Yeah, please do, that stuff is just strange. I should have anticipated this when coming to a place like this. Pete glanced at Sally, his nostrils flaring slightly, prompting her to quickly take the album back and tuck it into her bag. That's a lovely drawing, Toby, Sally commented as she observed her class of 6-year-olds creating egg designs for the upcoming spring festivities. It'll look fantastic once you paint it on an egg. Thank you, miss, the boy replied. My egg wasn't very good last year, so I want to make a better one this time for the best one to be chosen. That sounds exciting, Sally began, but then noticed Hazel standing in the doorway. I just wanted to check how you're settling in, she said, noticing the preparations for the spring equinox. All good, thanks. Then Sally remembered the photos. I should return this before I forget, she said, retrieving the album from her bag and making her way between the tables of children toward the classroom door. They're incredible photos. Thank you for letting me borrow them. No problem at all. I'm glad you had the chance to look at them, Hazel said, glancing down the corridor. It's essential that you have a clear understanding. I meant to ask about the play by the river. Under the tree? Play? There isn't any play, Sally. What do you mean by that? Sally stepped out into the hallway, shutting the classroom door behind her. Hazel tilted her head, eager to hear what Sally would say next. Feeling bewildered, Sally struggled to comprehend what she had witnessed, what Hazel was implying, and recalled Dan Oakland's comments from their time at the pub. Taylor Ackroyd's son. Sally hesitated, aware that this was her first week in a new position. Was he a student here? Sorry, it's just that... Sally, have you ever wondered why you were selected for this job? I'd like to think it's because I'm qualified and... Performed well in the interview, Sally replied cautiously, uncertain about where the discussion was heading. We conduct thorough investigations regarding newcomers to the village. You might not be aware, but you have ancestral connections to Rudtrow Clough, and the governors concluded that your lineage is strong enough. They believe that, over time, you will prove to be a valuable asset to our community. Bloodline? How? That's not something we should discuss right now, Hazel said, glancing through the window of the classroom. I'm afraid little Annie Stokes has just made quite a mess with paint. The chilly wind swirled around Sally's ankles as she cradled her coffee mug in the playground, observing the children as they ran and played. How are you settling in? One of the teachers, Mr. Swift, approached her, a football tucked under his arm. Just took this away from Billy Waitham before he breaks a window. He chuckled. What game are those kids playing over there? Sally asked, noticing a group of children gathered around, staring intently at the ground while another child lay on the floor, gazing up at the sky. Oh, they enjoy preparing for the spring rituals, Mr. Swift replied with a grin. I assume you're familiar with everything that takes place at the Red Tree by now. A shiver crept down Sally's neck, making her wonder if the spring celebrations were merely innocent childhood games. Oh yes, she answered simply. That evening, Pete was unusually quiet, distracted as he poked at his meal. What's bothering you, Pete? Sally asked while jotting down teaching notes and wrestling with her spaghetti. I took a stroll by the river today, to that tree in the picture. The red tree? Yeah. What was it like? Sally, do you think we made the right choice coming here? Pete set down his fork. I know it's a bit strange, but we'll adapt, Sally reassured him, then added tentatively, apparently, according to Hazel, I have ancestors from this area. That might clarify why they chose you for the position. I always found it strange to hand it over to someone unfamiliar. Pete gazed intently at Sally, expressing his discomfort about that tree, which gave him an unsettling feeling. What do you mean? How did it feel? Sally's growing anxiety wasn't just her own. She could tell Pete was experiencing it too. Its roots are all sticking out of the ground, and the soil around it has this odd texture. It's almost richer and thicker. Just felt off, that's all. Pete pushed his untouched plate away. Let's head to the pub for a drink. I can't deal with this right now for some reason. The White Lamb was bustling with activity, and as Pete and Sally stood at the bar sipping their beers, the door swung open and Taylor Ackroyd walked in, squeezing in beside them to order a pint. Allow me to cover that, Pete said, surprising himself. No need for that, Taylor replied gruffly, avoiding Pete's gaze. I don't want anything. From strangers. We'd like to get to know people better, Sally said softly. We noticed you the other day. Well, Taylor's tone softened slightly. I guess one pint wouldn't hurt. Dan served him and accepted Pete's payment with a cautionary look. Unsure of what to say next, the three took sips of their drinks until Sally broke the silence. We were saddened to hear about your son. Taylor wiped his forehead and glanced away for a moment. I suppose you're aware of what goes on during the spring equinox by now. Both Sally and Pete shook their heads. Not really, Sally replied. We're still trying to figure out what happens at the Red Tree. Step away from the bar then, Taylor said quietly. I'll explain, but not here. Outside the back entrance of the White Lamb, Taylor took a long drag from his cigarette and shared with Pete and Sally the village's spring equinox traditions, which balanced light and darkness. He spoke of how children hung their painted eggs on the red tree, followed by the selection of the egg deemed most perfect for its purpose. As he narrated the fate of the child who had created the chosen egg, Pete and Sally felt a wave of nausea wash over them, haunted by the images in Hazel's album. Taylor's voice trembled as he recounted the tragic destiny of his son, like so many before him, offered to the red tree, a symbol of both light and dark. His eyes appeared vacant as he uttered the name of the man responsible for selecting the egg, venomously spitting out the name, Dan Oaklands. Excitement and anticipation buzzed among the children as they carefully tied ribbons onto their decorated eggs, getting ready for the procession to the red tree. Sally, feeling physically ill and overwhelmed with worry from the previous days, guided her class into the schoolyard where they joined other children and Hazel Hartshorn, who was organizing everyone for the walk to the river and the sacred red tree. The sun broke through the wispy clouds, signaling the arrival of spring, while the children, clutching their treasured eggs, made their way through the village streets towards the river, singing joyfully. Spirit of spring, we sing to thee, to choose, the one beneath the tree. Our sacred eggs to you we bring, our sacrifice to you the spring. Sally's stomach twisted at the sight of Pete standing outside the White Lamb, with Taylor Ackroyd grim and silent beside him. She turned away, their eyes locking for just a moment before the procession rounded a corner toward the river and the red tree. There, the children, assisted by teachers and other adults who had joined in, hung their painted eggs from the gnarled branches. Sally gazed at the ecstatic faces of her class, a wave of disbelief crashing over her as she realized what she had become a part of. After the flurry of activity surrounding the hanging of the eggs, a hush fell over the assembled villagers, the only sounds being the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze and the soft murmuring of the river. Suddenly, from the crowd emerged the cloaked figure of Dan Oaklands, his large red hands raised high. We gather in this sacred space to quench the hunger of the red tree and select a gift that will honor the cycle of life and light, he proclaimed. The audience murmured softly, while the children exchanged eager glances and made room as Dan stepped forward to examine the eggs. A hush fell over the villagers as he meticulously inspected each one. Sally observed with dread for the children, tightening her every nerve as Dan moved among the eggs, holding her breath when his fingers hovered over the egg painted by little Toby, only to exhale in relief as he passed it by. Then Dan paused, turning his back to the crowd. A stillness enveloped the air as he raised the chosen egg high. It was beautifully adorned with intricate designs and vibrant hues. This egg had not been crafted by a child's hand. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd, and Sally noticed Hazel Hartshorn share a knowing look with Dan Oaklands, who nodded in response. With trepidation, Sally stepped forward, fear coursing through her as the villagers hummed softly together. Pete, realizing the gravity of the situation, shouted from the back of the crowd for her to halt. A struggle ensued, followed by a sickening thud as the villagers held him back. Sally felt nauseous, gripped by the horrifying truth of what was unfolding, as Dan guided her to the base of the red tree, where the children stood like guardians, around a shallow depression in the dark soil. As the humming intensified to a thunderous peak, Dan Oaklands extended his large hands toward Sally. It has been many years since our chosen one has held such significance, he called out to the crowd. The red tree will flourish this year, and so will all of Rudtrow Clough. As the crowd erupted in cheers, Sally's flickering gaze dimmed, and the bright spring sky turned heavy. Resigned to her grim fate, the faces of the children faded away behind Dan Oakland's forceful grip, and knowing she had saved at least one child for another year, Sally surrendered to the weighty darkness of the earth and the ancient twisted roots of the red tree. Each year, we would extend an invitation to Ben for our New Year's celebration. We had welcomed him for so long that his presence had woven itself into the very fabric of our holiday traditions, connecting everyone who participated in this cherished time. Annually, we would reach out to Ben, and he would respond with a non-committal promise of possibly attending. His words suggested he might show up, but that ambiguity felt like an insurmountable barrier that kept us apart for years. Wish I could say I anticipated what was about to unfold, or that I sensed trouble brewing on the horizon. Perhaps I did. However, it's also true that we often ignore our gut feelings. In hindsight, we tend to reshape events to portray ourselves in a more favorable light than reality. Most situations only become clear once we reflect on them, crafting a narrative that smooths over any inconsistencies or gaps. The New Year's Eve, when Ben finally decided to come, was exceptionally frigid. The air was eerily still, as if it were holding its breath in suspense. accompanied by mist swirling over the icy ground like sorrowful spirits clashing with silent wraiths. I envisioned Ben stepping out from that fog, pausing at our doorstep. For what felt like an eternity, his arm extended, fist poised to knock on the weathered oak door. Ben never relied on doorbells. His knocks were unmistakable. There was nothing hesitant about that knock or the man himself. Yet, he possessed a gentle demeanor, dangerously gentle. To disturb his tranquility would unleash a force of nature. Only a fool or a madman would dare to do such a thing. Then he shattered the silence and transformed everything. His knock resonated throughout the house, causing us all to halt our activities. Our group was complete, and we weren't expecting anyone else. This was a momentous occasion, and we all recognized it. After a brief pause, we exchanged glances. "You go." "No, you go." No one wanted to face what felt like an entry into another realm, a new twist to a year that was nearly over. We should have heeded that cautious quiet. Better yet, someone should have spoken up, but no one did. I swung open the door to reveal a damp figure filling the entrance. His disheveled appearance was somewhat pitiful, yet it couldn't conceal his raw presence. I felt a mix of fear and excitement at his arrival. We had longed for him to be with us, and now that wish had come true. "Come in," I urged him, attempting to sound enthusiastic, but the chilly mist stifled my voice. He nodded silently as he stepped inside, escaping the harsh cold outside. I shut the door against the dreadful weather and took his wet wax jacket from him. It dripped as I carried it toward the nearby cupboard, but reconsidering, I decided to hang it on the end of the banister instead, not wanting it to contaminate the other coats. I motioned towards the living room, and he brought with him an unsettling silence cloaked like a shroud of writhing serpents. My ears popped as we descended. The atmosphere shifted as soon as he entered the room, a rising tide that subdued the evening's warmth. Despite this, he was welcomed warmly. Automatic phrases spilled from eager mouths, following social norms. Hands were shaken, and he accepted a drink, finishing the glass in one go. The evening's rhythm bent and stretched but held firm. Another drink found its way into his hand, which he took care of before finally speaking up. "There's been an incident." His words struck a discordant note, and their implications were even more jarring. In that moment, murder would have seemed less shocking. The spirit of the night had already been shattered. I felt the urge to step in, to intervene, but the magnitude of what was unfolding made me feel insignificant. This was larger than any of us. Nothing would ever return to how it was. The very essence of our lives was burning away before us, destined to unravel into nothingness. It had already begun. We're unaware of it then. Ben was simply the bearer of the news. Messengers are often ambiguous figures carrying the foul scent of bad news, making them a despised lot, even if they are gentle giants at heart. Ben was always an enigma, almost otherworldly. It was clear that he had lived through another existence, shaped by deep suffering. He didn't quite fit in, yet he was cherished nonetheless. His love was a powerful force, and in return, he received love that mirrored his own intensity. No one could rival the depth of his affection, nor did anyone attempt to. Our feelings were more akin to friendship, easily exchanged like smiles after a slight misunderstanding. We fell into our battle formations. Some of us kept Ben contained while others sought information. A group set out to uncover exactly what was happening. I was part of that team, relieved to escape the house and its brooding presence. I suspected my companions felt similarly. We were the cowards and the misfits, bold in our actions yet fleeing from what we believed to be the worst. Perhaps this is the essence of true courage. Once we stepped outside the comforting warmth of the house, our unity began to unravel, and the chilling mist took advantage of our disarray. Each of us walked alone as we made our way toward the big house. Something terrible had transpired. We were certain of that. Yet our introspective natures prevented us from grasping the full extent of the situation. We trivialized it, reducing it to a digestible narrative, unwilling to confront a present or future that might be tainted or shattered. I had never witnessed the big house under such circumstances. The mist cloaked its formidable structure, revealing its true nature. This place was ancient in a way that transcended our understanding. The history of a site like this was never covered in school. There were references to such monumental places in the Bible, and those references served as warnings. No matter how frigid the night air felt, we were even colder. None of us had the desire to push forward, yet our shared presence compelled us onward. Our fearful silence betrayed us. The main entrance was slightly open, and as we stepped inside, I realized there was no turning back. This moment marked a significant change for all of us. With my shoulders hunched and walking carefully on my toes, I pondered what Ben had witnessed. My perception of him was shifting now that I was here. Before, I viewed him as a possible instigator of something dreadful. Now, it became clear he had seen it, and had been marked by a sinister force that rarely revealed itself. Was he fortunate to have survived such an ordeal? I was beginning to question that notion. In here, I recognized that voice. It belonged to Jeff the accountant, a diligent man who enjoyed long walks and treated himself to a good ale afterward. I moved toward the sound, noticing others doing the same. 3 of us reached the kitchen, where the dim light above illuminated 2 smeared trails of blood. "Where's Jeff?" Alan the plumber asked, his question unnecessary. No one responded. The truth of what had happened and Jeff's fate lay before us. Here, once again, the voice was unmistakable. It was Harry, the meat, a butcher who had retired 16 years ago. Alan stepped forward, but Barry held him back, stopping his advance. The denial on Alan's face remained, yet he accepted the restraint. Still, we moved toward the voice of our fellow villager, but with the demeanor of professional mourners. There was no urgency. At the end of this journey, there was only the grim scene of another crime. We relied on the safety of numbers, as we always do. On the polished wooden floor of the dining room, 3 trails of blood lay visible. One was particularly fresh and liquid. In the end, Harry had met the same grim fate as his meat. But where his remains now rested was anyone's guess. We exchanged glances, a trio gripped by fear and retreat. I gestured toward the exit. The reactions of my companions were unreadable, but honestly, I wasn't interested in deciphering them. My determination to escape this place was unwavering, and I hoped that my resolve would lead us all out before we faced the same grim fate as 2 of our fellow villagers had already endured. And let's not forget the previous residents of the big house. I made my exit. That was the bottom line. If pressed, I would swear that Alan and Barry were with me when we departed from the big house. Innocent Alan and the gentle, soft-spoken Barry, an elderly man who seemed to have been born with an air of wisdom and tranquility. He was truly suited for a peaceful old age. Yet, by the time I returned to my family home, I found myself alone, accompanied only by that dreadful mist. It wrapped around me like the fingers of death, filling me with despair even before I noticed. The door of our house standing awkwardly ajar. As I stepped into the hallway, there he was. Ben stood there in his damp wax coat once more. His head was lowered, yet he still loomed over me. "Ben?" I called out, hoping he would say something, to lift the heavy weight of anguish I felt. "There's been a happening," he murmured, his voice sounding foreign and distant. The rulebook seemed a bit excessive to me. I had taken care of houses for nearly everyone in the neighborhood. I figured I was experienced enough not to need someone guiding me through it all. The tasks were straightforward. Keep everything tidy, respect their privacy, look after the pets, and no visitors without asking first. It was so easy that even a kindergartner could manage it. But I wasn't a child. I was a 22-year-old woman clutching a leather-bound book labeled Rules. I didn't know much about the Hinchcliffes. At that time, they were fairly new to the area, having moved in just 5 or 6 months prior. What I did know was that they preferred to stay out of the spotlight and often skipped community gatherings whenever possible. My younger cousins would concoct wild stories about them, claiming they were vampires or cannibals. My mother simply questioned why they chose to live there, If they want to be left alone so badly, they shouldn't have moved to the suburbs, she'd say. Meanwhile, my dad was completely obsessed with the idea. If you ask me, there's something supernatural about those Hinchcliffes. I wouldn't go near them. However, since my dad was always looking for a chance to chat, I took his comments with a pinch of skepticism. They were offering me $600 for 2 nights, so I wasn't about to let some superstitions get in the way. When I flipped open the book, I realized it looked almost ancient. The pages were worn and stained with various substances that had seeped into the fibers over time. I wasn't an expert on history, but it felt like this book belonged in a museum, definitely not in my possession. The Hinchcliffes didn't have any kids, yet they chose to move into the biggest house in the neighborhood, likely to showcase the numerous artifacts displayed on every wall around me. The handwriting in the book was beautifully crafted, resembling elegant cursive from colonial times. "Good evening, sir or madam. We truly appreciate your willingness to accept our invitation. However, before you can effectively oversee our estate and its various features, there are a few conditions you must adhere to. These guidelines are set not only to protect our home, but also to ensure your safety. Please pay close attention to the following rules and make sure to follow them carefully. Please refrain from following any voices you may hear. They are merely illusions and should be disregarded. Do not venture back upstairs until the sounds have ceased. If you need some noise to mask it, there's a phonograph in the den. Avoid touching or getting too close to the paintings, as they might seem to be observing you. It's best not to investigate further. All dishes must be washed, dried, and returned to their designated spots before bedtime. Anything left in the sink will mysteriously disappear by morning. You may have guests, but they must leave before midnight, and are required to read this book as well. Our family cannot be held accountable for what happens to anyone you bring into this house. Under no circumstances should you engage in board games. By doing so unknowingly, you invite them to join in. If you forget this rule or break it, you must allow them to win. Once you settle into bed, remain there until morning. It's far better to soil your sheets than to get out of bed. After midnight, steer clear of all mirrors. Do not look at them, stand near them, or turn towards them. You now have 30 minutes to decide whether you'd like to stay and uphold your agreement. Should you choose to remain, please adhere to all these rules, keep the house tidy, and you will receive your full payment upon the Hinchcliffe's return. I wish you the best of luck. Aberdeen. Hinchcliffe. A wave of anxiety washed over me as I contemplated what I had just stepped into. I quickly reached out to my sister, who was quick to brush off the entire situation. The Hinchcliffes are such oddballs, Kat. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if they just enjoy messing with their guests. Her words eased my mind a bit. Surely, I was just getting swept up in the moment and not really thinking about how absurd those rules were. I decided it was probably just a silly prank, and after our conversation, I resolved to stick it out. I should have seen it coming. For the first few hours, I found myself glued to my phone, scrolling through social media and reminiscing about my college days. I had left after my second year when my parents told me they could no longer support me financially, which I completely understood. My dad had recently lost his job, and we'd been relying on unemployment benefits for the past year. That's a big reason why I started house sitting. It kept me out of the house, provided some extra cash, and let me enjoy someone else's electricity for a few days. I rarely spent much time at home. Once people learned about my house-sitting gig, I typically bounced from one place to another, spending a few days watching someone's home, crashing at Dylan's for a couple of nights, heading back to repack my bag, and then moving on to the next job. It helped me feel less like a burden, especially since my sister had her own apartment and hadn't asked for a dime from our parents in nearly 10 years. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little envious of her. She got to attend college 12 years ago, with full financial backing from our parents, while here I was, sitting on a worn leather couch in a family that seemed straight out of a vampire movie, surrounded by their overly rustic decor. Life can be quite ironic if you manage to pause your tears long enough to see it. At some point, I decided it was time to stop sulking and actually explore my surroundings. I thought it would be wise to get acquainted with the layout before nightfall. I started on the upper floor since that's where I'd be sleeping. My plan was to locate my room and then trace my steps back from there. As I wandered through the mahogany corridors, I had to keep reminding myself of the current year. The oil paintings and crystal chandeliers were whisking me away to the vibrant 1920s. I maintained a respectful distance from the artwork, as my father's superstitions lingered in my mind. It felt more courteous to keep away so as not to disturb such fragile pieces of history. Most of the paintings appeared quite ordinary, easing my concerns about any potential rules. That was until I stumbled upon one at the end of the hallway. It had little description aside from the date 1872 etched on a small gold plaque at the bottom. It seemed absurd, but the painting bore an uncanny resemblance to me. The eyes were strikingly similar, featuring the same sunken edges in green tint as mine. It sported my straight black hair cascading down its shoulders. My signature pale complexion was also present. To top it off, it even had my distinctive chin. The only clear difference was the attire. The figure in the painting donned a maroon evening gown with white puffed sleeves and buttons so high they nearly choked her neck. Definitely one contrast between us. Although I doubt women wore flannel back in 1872. Eventually, I located my room, a cozy nook tucked away at the back of the house with walls filled from floor to ceiling with books. I would have loved to dive into a few if I hadn't been so anxious about disturbing them. The rest of the house was just as expected. An abundance of books, a handful of porcelain figurines, and at least 3 studies, 2 more than any household really needs. Once I returned to the couch, I decided to give Dylan a call to see if he could swing by. I didn't have permission for him to stay overnight, but I figured he could at least hang out until it got dark. "Hey." A voice echoed from a distant part of the house. I set my phone aside and strained to listen, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. I must have sat there in silence for nearly 10 minutes, hoping for some sort of confirmation about what I had just heard, but nothing came. Eventually, I gave up, resigning myself to the idea that the solitude was starting to get to me. About 30 minutes later, Dylan arrived. He brought pizza, which I appreciated since I had no desire to whip up something with the random ingredients lurking in the pantry. We plopped down on the couch, flipping through random reality shows until the glow from my laptop screen felt like it was searing into my eyes. I got up to wash the dishes we had used, preparing for bed afterward. Dylan had glanced at the house rules when he arrived, so he immediately started poking fun at me for adhering to them so strictly. "You better hurry with those. Don't want the dish goblins to get their hands on them," he chuckled. But I found his humor immature and somewhat tone-deaf. He wasn't exactly known for holding down jobs or acknowledging any responsibilities, which meant every new place I took care of was just another opportunity for us to hook up. I brushed off his comments and finished washing the dishes, making sure to put everything back in its rightful spot. I want to clarify that this wasn't out of fear or anxiety. It was purely a matter of respect. Thomas Hinchcliffe might have been eccentric, but that didn't mean I would disregard his rules, even if they seemed a bit out there. It took quite a bit of effort to get him out after dinner. He kept pulling me close, insisting it wouldn't hurt, to let him stay the night. At one point, he even followed me to my room, which was the final straw. I turned him around and told him that if he wanted to still have a girlfriend in the morning, he needed to leave. He responded with some harsh words about how I was so difficult when I'm working, and how I always know how to kill the vibe. I didn't care at all and slammed the door in his face. Once he was finally gone, I glanced at the clock and saw it was almost midnight. I wasn't trying to be superstitious, at least that's what I kept telling myself, but I knew it was time for bed. I made my way upstairs, turning off lights and closing doors along the way. As I approached my room, it struck me just how creepy the place looked at night. It felt like a museum after hours. If it hadn't been so unsettling, I might have thought to make a night at the museum joke or something similar. However, considering what happened next, I really wish I had noticed those similarities earlier. I made the mistake of crawling into bed first. After a long day, I was completely worn out. This was part of my usual routine. I would spend a little time on my phone in bed, brush my teeth, and then climb back under the covers. But as soon as I stood up again, I heard the most horrifying scream my ears could ever imagine, and that's when it dawned on me. Rule 6. Do not get out of your bed until morning. And there it was, broken. Great. I was jolted forward when I felt something brush against my ankles, glancing down to see what appeared to be 4 shadowy claws emerging from beneath the bed. In a panic, I dashed out of the room as quickly as possible, finding myself in the main hallway of the house where the voices grew louder and more intense, transforming into a chaotic symphony of groans and screams, echoes of lives that had been lost or forgotten. As I looked up, I was met with what could only be described as a dozen piercing red eyes boring into me, each pair originating from different paintings hanging on the walls. It seemed that the screams were emanating from them too, and in my frantic state, I had gotten too close to one, allowing it to reach out and scratch my right shoulder. Rule 2. Do not touch or get too close to the paintings. That rule was clearly broken. I recoiled and hurried away from the paintings. My first instinct was to escape this nightmare. Since I wasn't familiar enough with the house to know any hidden exits, the front door seemed like my best bet. I navigated the twisting wooden corridors until I reached the kitchen den at the front of the house. As I rushed through, heading for the door, I was confronted by an enormous shadowy figure standing guard at the entrance. It turned to face me and broke into a full sprint toward me. Realizing the front door was no longer a viable option, I bolted back to where I had just come from. I stumbled upon the bathroom at the end of the hall, and without a second thought, I dashed inside. I slammed the door shut and locked both bolts. Panic set in as I hyperventilated, my lungs feeling like they were on fire. The only thing I could think to do was call Dylan, my fingers trembling as I struggled to type his name into my contacts. I pressed the phone to my ear while my other hand applied pressure to the wound on my shoulder. Though the adrenaline dulled my senses, I could tell I was bleeding heavily. "Kat, if you're going to apologize, I don't want to hear it," he said, my boiling rage overshadowed by the overwhelming fear coursing through me. "Dylan, you have to come get me. It's real. It's really happening," I shouted. The voices had reached the door, and they were so loud that it felt like my ears might burst. Somehow, I doubted Dylan could hear a word I was saying. "Are you kidding me, Kat? You're being completely overdramatic right now. Just stop with the nonsense." I was taken aback by how quickly he brushed off my fear and suffering as mere paranoia. "Dylan, please listen. I'm bleeding and—" I halted mid-sentence, frozen, in shock as I gazed at my reflection. Oh no. Rule 8. Stay away from all mirrors after midnight. Do not look at them, stand near them, or even turn towards them. Shattered, there I was, staring deep into my own essence. I felt immobilized, as if something was pinning me down with immense force. Every muscle in my body, including my throat, felt completely trapped under the weight of this presence. My phone slipped from my grasp and hit the floor. I could faintly hear Dylan calling out to me, but I was powerless to reply. My breaths became rapid and shallow. Then everything went dark. When I regained consciousness, I found myself enveloped in complete darkness, with no light touching any surface around me. As I pushed myself up from the ground, I realized the pain in my shoulder had vanished, replaced by a strange numbness where the injury used to be. The voices had also faded away, leaving an eerie silence behind. It felt like I had been placed in one of those sensory deprivation tanks. Oddly enough, even in this pitch-black environment, I could see my body clearly. It was as if, regardless of the lighting, everything around me remained shrouded in shadow. I scanned the empty space until I spotted a small window in the distance. I rushed toward it, only to discover I couldn't open it or escape through it. I cried out, praying someone would hear me, but there was nothing. When I took a moment to peer through the window, I realized it led to the hallway of paintings I had encountered before. But this time, it was my own image on the wall, exactly where that portrait resembling me had once hung. That's when I heard the distant sound of a door creaking open. followed by the footsteps of someone entering the house. Cat. Where the hell? Did you go? It was Dylan, his voice filled with urgency. I could tell that the frantic cries followed by an eerie stillness had crossed his line of not my concern. As he drew closer, still calling out for me, I attempted to grab his attention, but my words fell flat. I felt like I was in a soundproof bubble, unable to make myself heard. When he reached the hallway, I noticed something emerging on the wall, opposite me. Another portrait, this one with a more contemporary style. As it took shape before my eyes, I realized it bore an uncanny resemblance to Dylan. He stepped into the hallway, gazing at the collection of paintings, likely depicting the unfortunate souls from the Hinchcliffe's past homes. Whatever entity or spirit haunted their lineage had an insatiable hunger. The only rule was to give visitors a fighting chance, one that I had already lost, a battle that Dylan had forced me to surrender. As he strolled down the hall toward me, he paused at my portrait, locking eyes with my cold, painted gaze. I didn't yearn for his embrace. Instead, all my love and warmth had been replaced by sheer rage. He turned away, confronting his own likeness on the wall. This was his doing. He was the reason I found myself trapped in this never-ending nightmare. He was the one who deserved this suffering, not me. I extended my hand through the portal in the wall, transforming it into a grotesque claw-like silhouette, slowly reaching for his throat. Have you ever locked eyes with a rattlesnake? Have you ever found yourself standing there realizing that the rattlesnake was upright and staring right back at you? Have you ever been so close to one that you could hear it breathing? Do those thoughts make you want to run away in fear? I've spent my entire life in desert territory. While hiking or strolling through the area, I've encountered nearly every type of desert animal. Yet there's only one that sends chills down my spine: rattlesnakes. Rattlesnakes come in many shades: green, blue, brown, black, adorned with silver diamonds, red, or even a mix of these colors. Regardless of their appearance, they all terrify me. I own a piece of land a few miles off the highway, accessible via a dirt road. It's so dark out there that I can navigate by starlight, with the stars shining brilliantly above. The property is a perfectly fenced rectangle nestled among thousands of acres of ranch land. Right in the center, there's a horseshoe-shaped hill that rises about 75 feet above the surrounding land. About a year before I relocated from town to this property, I experienced a series of frightening dreams. In one dream about rattlesnakes, while hiking through rugged terrain, I stumbled upon a dry watercourse roughly 5 feet wide and 4 feet deep, cutting through caliche and other types of soil. The banks had undercuts extending 2 or 3 feet inward. As I leaned over the edge to examine the cutouts across the watercourse, I heard the buzzing sound of what seemed like 1,000 large insects. No, it was actually the sound of dozens of rattlesnakes hiding in a cutout just below where I stood. Naturally, I became anxious and stepped back from the edge, waking up in the process. In another rattlesnake dream, I was camping next to a grade break about 3 feet high. It was late, and the stars were bright enough to provide some light. Suddenly, a 4-foot-wide cutout about 18 inches high in that grade break illuminated, causing me to wake up in my dream. I rolled over to peer into the cutout, which extended 50 feet or more, revealing a floor covered in a writhing mass of snakes. I never imagined that so many could fit into such a small space. I woke up feeling utterly panicked. As the morning progressed, it struck me that I should spend a night camping alone on my land before the new year rolled in. I thought about grabbing a ground tarp and some blankets to sleep right on the earth. Now imagine this. After enduring 2 nights filled with unsettling rattlesnake dreams, I suddenly felt compelled to go sleep solo on the ground in an area notorious for snakes. Not a chance. This theme of those nightmares kept recurring every night for another week. Each time I woke up, the urge to camp out alone in snake territory nagged at me. By Wednesday morning, after experiencing the 9th dream, I made up my mind to go that weekend. Miraculously, the snake dreams ceased. On Saturday morning, I hit the road heading north to my property. After 3 hours, I reached a small town about 8 miles away. enjoyed dinner at the A-Frame Cafe, and then made my way to my campsite to get everything ready. Atop the horseshoe-shaped hill, I set up my little campsite. It was going to be a chilly night since I didn't really need a fire. My plan was to head into town early the next morning for huevos rancheros and coffee, so even in the morning, a fire wasn't necessary. I laid out my tarp, used my rolled-up truck coat as a pillow, and spread out my blankets. While waiting for darkness to fall, I relaxed in my truck and read an Asimov novel. Once night fell, I climbed out of the truck, settled onto my makeshift bed, covered myself up, and quickly drifted off to sleep. It was a tranquil and pleasant night. Suddenly, a hissing sound jolted me awake. It was a loud, unmistakable hiss that left no room for doubt about its origin. I cautiously lifted my blanket, sat up, and then stood up slowly, turning to my left, where fear gripped me. There she was, raising her head and tilting it back to get a better look at me. Her forked tongue flicked in my direction as she opened her mouth, revealing fangs that seemed as long as my arm from elbow to fingertips. Her unblinking slit eyes locked onto my soul and mind. I stood frozen, staring back, fully aware that if I tried to run, she could strike before I could even take my next breath. Her head was broader than the length of my torso, her eyes as large as softballs, and her tongue longer than I am tall. Surrounding her, her minions writhed and observed. There were dozens of them, stretching out as far as my eyes could see. Although smaller than her, they were still quite sizable. None had a head smaller than mine, and not one of them blinked. They were silent, just watching me intently. I felt an overwhelming sense of fear. She let out a hiss, and suddenly words echoed in my mind. Your scent of fear is strong, creating a cloud that extends far from your core. Yet here you stand, unmoving, gazing back at me with both your fear and curiosity. You remain unafraid, untouched, and quiet, and you're neither whimpering nor crying, begging or praying. You are frightened, curious, and patient. Your courage earns you my favor. From this moment on, you have been chosen to care for us, protect us, and honor us. You understand our habitat. Teach others how to safeguard it. You know our ways, how easily we can be startled and how we react when threatened. Inform your kind that we prefer solitude and are quick to panic at any sudden movements. Advise them to make noise while walking through underbrush, and to be cautious about where they place their hands and feet when climbing over rocks or logs. When you see us crossing open spaces, especially roads, please help us safely navigate or shield us from danger. Show us respect. Remember, we are creatures of the same God who created the dawn. Her dry hiss, reminiscent of a summer breeze, acknowledged me but offered no comfort. You are now part of the Snake Clan. You will pass by us without harm, so declares I, the Queen. In an instant, I found myself standing on the hilltop, gazing at the starlit cedar trees and scrub oak. There were no snakes in sight. I hadn't anticipated that. Now, whenever I encounter snakes, they buzz to alert me of their presence, coil up, then uncoil and glide away. Despite this, they still frighten me.